Okay, so like imagine this, right? A future where it's faith calling the shots, not science.
Right.
Like all our tech and freedoms, the whole power structure, all reshaped by what people believe, religiously.
Yeah.
Wild, right? Total dystopian movie material.
It's interesting, though. It's not just a what-if scenario. Like the stuff you had me read, the World of the Faithful book, and especially that Letter to the Faithful Addendum,
Yeah.
they make a pretty good argument that this, like, faith-heavy future, it might be closer than we think.
Really?
And it all comes down to something most people don't really think about much: demographics,
Hmm.
population stuff.
Wait, hold on. How can just, like, how many people there are have that much power?
Think of it this way. Population trends, they're not just numbers. They shape everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Economic power, military strength, even the whole vibe of a civilization.
Okay.
What these readings are getting at is, like, as societies get more secular, they kind of shift,
Yeah.
from that community mindset to a more like me first kind of thing.
Mm.
And that impacts everything: how many kids people have, what kind of politics they support. It's all connected.
So it's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
Secularism, smaller families, then the whole society kind of loses its edge.
Exactly. And the readings highlight this big contrast we see happening right now.
Like what?
You've got the developed world, right? A lot of them struggling with fewer and fewer babies being born.
Hmm.
And then, boom, you've got these developing nations with populations just exploding. And often it's in places where religion is a big deal.
Yeah, they even brought up that South Korea thing, how their birth rate is so low that guys are literally looking for wives in Southeast Asia where having a family is still like the norm.
Pretty drastic, right?
Makes you wonder, like, are these population trends actually shaping destiny? Just having tons of people who all believe the same thing become like the strongest force on the planet.
That's a question worth thinking about. And the authors argue that we're already seeing it play out in how Western influence is kind of fading globally.
Ah, yeah. That's where it gets really interesting. They talk about how after World War II, when Western populations started shrinking, it contributed to the end of colonialism and this gradual shift in global power. Like we're at some tipping point now.
Right. We see the U.S. dollar being challenged, countries just ignoring Western sanctions,
Yeah.
and there's even pushback against ideas like gender equality or even secularism itself.
Uh,
You brought up that law in Ghana against the LGBTQ plus community. That's one example. Or look at Togo. They actually made female genital mutilation legal again.
Whoa.
These are signs of a pretty big change happening.
But here's a twist I didn't see coming. They're saying the West declining doesn't automatically mean other secular powers, like China or Russia, will win.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because think about it, the same stuff driving this religious resurgence, it could also be a problem for regimes like China and Russia, which are basically built on atheism.
Absolutely.
It seems contradictory, right? How can they buddy up with religious nations if their whole ideology is against religion?
It raises a fascinating question.
Yeah, what's that?
Could we actually be seeing a whole new power block forming? One that's all about shared faith instead of those secular ideologies? It's something the readings definitely hint at.
Okay, so then they dig into why religious institutions are gaining so much traction, especially in developing countries. I thought that comparison they made between, like, the help offered by Western NGOs versus what faith-based groups do was really fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we connect that to the big picture, it's about more than just giving practical aid.
Right, right,
Often, NGOs come with conditions.
right.
They might impose things that clash with local customs or push values people aren't really into.
Which can cause resentment, make people push back. Whereas these faith-based groups, they seem to have an easier time getting in. They give practical help, like food, medicine, but also like spiritual support and chances for people to become leaders within their communities.
It's a different approach.
It makes you think about what really motivates people, right? Sometimes that need for connection, for purpose, it outweighs the practical stuff. Like, imagine you're struggling to survive just getting by. A group comes along, offers food, medicine, A&D, a sense of belonging that might be way more appealing than an NGO focused on just one specific issue.
It makes sense.
And it all circles back to that birth rate gap, right? The authors keep saying that's the big driver behind this whole global shift thing.
Yeah, and what they point out is that gap isn't just between countries, it's happening within societies too.
Really?
Even in developed countries, they found that people who are religious tend to have bigger families.
Ah.
And as secularism, that individualism thing, keeps
Mhm.
rising, birth rates keep dropping, it's a pattern all over the place.
It's almost like the more secular a society gets, the fewer kids people have, and so it shrinks, loses its influence. And that addendum letter was really blunt about it. They talked about how, like, the hollowness of secular thought leads to mental illness and despair, pushes people further away from those values.
It's pretty heavy stuff. And the authors of the Letter to the Faithful, they don't sugarcoat the potential consequences. They paint this picture of the future, a world ravaged by environmental damage and social unrest. Resources are dwindling, and faith becomes like this source of strength, community,
Whoa.
simply because there's nothing else left to rely on.
Okay, wow. That's a lot to take in. It's
Yeah,
a pretty intense image.
right.
Makes you wonder, will this return to faith create a more spiritual, like harmonious way of life? Or could it, swing the other way? Open the door to new kinds of conflict and oppression. Seems like there's potential for both.
The readings acknowledge that tension too. They don't shy away from the fact that, religion has
Huh.
a history of conflict,
Yeah.
that theocracy can be dangerous. But they also point to that deep human need for meaning, for connection, something faith often provides in a way that, like, secular ideologies just can't.
I can see both sides, and it makes me wonder, like, how would this play out globally? We're already seeing religious nationalism popping up in different places. Could that intensify as these demographic shifts keep happening? And what about, like, the current power dynamics? Could this lead to like a clash of civilizations based on religion, or could we see some kind of, I don't know, uneasy coexistence?
The authors seem to think a full-blown clash is unlikely, at least not in the traditional sense. They suggest the decline of Western influence won't necessarily mean one single power taking over.
Oh,
Instead, they see a more fragmented world. Power spread across multiple blocks, some based on faith, others on secular ideas, still others on, regional alliances.
so a multipolar world, but with religion as like a major player in the mix. That's a pretty different way of looking at things than we're used to.
Absolutely. It challenges a lot of assumptions we have about progress, the role of technology, even the future of individual liberties.
Speaking of technology, you know that part in World of the Faithful where they talked about technological cargo cults? That really stuck with me. Sounds fascinating and kind of terrifying at the same time.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. It gets at this potential disconnect that can happen between technological advancement and, like, actually understanding things.
Huh.
What the author's suggesting is, as Western influence fades, those scientific principles kind of lose their grip, we could see societies pop up that have access to advanced tech, but, like, without the knowledge base to really understand it or
Yeah.
maintain it.
So almost like a society that knows how to use a smartphone but has no clue how it actually works or how to build one.
Exactly.
I can see how that could get messy really fast.
And it raises some pretty unsettling questions. Like, imagine a world where these powerful technologies are treated almost like magic,
Oh, wow.
wielded without really understanding their potential consequences.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially with things like AI and genetic engineering becoming more and more powerful.
It's a sobering thought for sure. And it underlines how important it is not just to have knowledge, but to understand it, its context, its limitations, and, most importantly, like, its ethical implications.
Feels like these authors are calling for a kind of like global reckoning, a deep reflection on our values and priorities. Like they're saying, hey, time to step back and think about where we're headed.
Yeah, that's definitely a key takeaway here. They're urging us to look beyond the immediate headlines and really wrestle with these long-term trends
Right.
and to ask some tough questions. What will guide us in this uncertain future? What role do we want to play in shaping it?
And what about the role of faith in all this? The letter to the faithful feels like both a warning and a call to action for people who believe in something beyond the material world. Like they're saying, get ready, things are about to get intense, but you have a unique opportunity to make a difference.
There's a definite sense of urgency there. They acknowledge the challenges, but also emphasize the unique role faith communities can play, providing guidance, support, hope. In a world that's becoming more fractured and uncertain, they're calling for a kind of spiritual leadership.
But they also warn about the dangers of religious power, right? That potential for falling back into old patterns of intolerance and oppression.
Absolutely. They explicitly warn against using faith as a tool for control, for coercion. Instead, they stress the importance of compassion, tolerance, genuine respect for the diversity of belief and experience. It's a reminder that faith can be a powerful force for good, but it's not inherently good or bad. It all depends on the choices we make, both individually and collectively.
And those choices, they're going to have huge consequences, not just for us, but for generations to come.
It is something to think about as we move forward.
We've covered a lot of ground here. Demographics, the decline of the West, the rise of religious power, the potential for both progress and conflict. It's a lot to wrap your head around, and some of it, I gotta admit, is pretty unsettling.
It is a lot to process. And it's important to remember, we've just explored two perspectives on a very complex issue. There are many other voices out there, lots of factors at play.
Yeah, it's a lot. And while all this global stuff is fascinating, it can also feel kind of, I don't know, abstract, like something happening way out there that doesn't really touch our everyday lives.
I get that. But what I think makes this whole deep dive so powerful is how it ultimately brings it all back to us. Like these trends, they're playing out in real people's lives, individuals grappling with what they believe, trying to figure out how to live in a world that's constantly shifting.
And that's where it gets personal, right? It's not just some theoretical debate anymore. It's like, wait, what does all this mean for me? How will my life actually be affected? And maybe even more importantly, what role do I want to play in all this?
Yeah. And that letter to the faithful is really direct in its call to action. It urges people of faith to get ready for what's coming, be beacons of hope in a world that's becoming more and more fractured. They're talking about a kind of spiritual leadership, but like one that's rooted in compassion and understanding.
Yeah, and it leads into what I thought was the most thought-provoking question in the whole thing, something they ask directly to the faithful, but I think it's something everyone should be asking themselves.
Oh, which one?
Will a future shaped by faith be one of tolerance and understanding, or will it just devolve into theocracy and conflict?
$1 million question. Right.
It really is.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. History shows us both, right?
Right.
It all comes down to choices, individual and collective. Are we going to use faith to divide and control, or to build bridges and unite? The readings we looked at today, they offer a pretty radical perspective shift. They challenge so much of what we think about progress, about technology, even about individual freedoms. It's like a wake-up call. Hey, the world's changing, maybe in ways you don't even see. Time to start thinking differently about the future.
And to start examining our own values. What really matters? What are we willing to fight for? What kind of legacy do we want to leave behind?
Those are big questions, but they're worth asking. Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. We make it through our choices, our action, how we engage with the world.
I couldn't agree more. So as you go from here, from this deep dive, keep those questions in mind. Stay curious, stay informed, and above all, stay engaged. The future's unfolding right now, and it's up to each of us to decide what part we'll play.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and